Life's been a series of tough breaks and lucky strikes. Losing my parents early stung like hell, but I got lucky when the elderly couple next door, the Parkers, took me in. They were the kindest souls you could imagine, treating me more like a granddaughter than a charity case. We weren't rich in money, but we were wealthy in love, and that's what mattered. Then, just as I was coming into my own, turning 18 and thinking about college, they died in a car accident. Just like that, I was on my own again. The Parkers left me a bit of money for school and their old house in the suburbs. It was a cozy place, full of memories, but too many ghosts for me. So, I sold it and bought a small apartment in the city near the college where I'd enrolled to study financial management. It felt good, having a plan, moving forward. Classes were tough but interesting, and I threw myself into learning everything about numbers and markets. After college, I landed a decent job. Daytimes were packed with work, and I was doing all right, but nights were another story. The city felt lonelier than it should for a place so full. That's when I met Tom at a friend's party. He was loud, funny, and didn't care who knew it. His energy was infectious, and we hit it off from the moment he bumped into me, spilling my drink. "Hey, watch it!" I snapped, more out of surprise than anger. "Whoa, my bad. Let me make it up to you. What were you drinking?" Tom grinned, unapologetically charming. "Beer, just beer," I said, trying not to smile too easily. "2 beers coming right up," he shouted over the music, heading to the makeshift bar. That was Tom all over, simple, straightforward, and no fuss. We spent the whole night talking about everything and nothing. It turned out we both loved old movies and hated sushi. It was easy, talking to him, and by the time the party was winding down, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed. No dramatic gestures, just him, me, and a ring he fumbled out of his pocket while we were watching TV. "Marry me," he told, holding the ring so tightly I thought he might crush it. I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of us, so perfectly imperfect. "Yes, of course, you big goof." Getting married didn't change much at first. We were the same, just legally bound, which felt right. We settled into life together in my small city apartment, still close to the hustle, but now with someone to share the quiet moments. Life felt full, and for the first time in a long while, the evenings didn't feel so empty. Settling into married life had its comforts, but life sure doesn't let you get too cozy without throwing a curveball or two. Jake's folks, Mr. and Mrs. Harper, were gems. Living in their cozy suburban home, they welcomed me with open arms from the get-go. I could see where Jake got his easygoing nature. Their warmth was a balm on my oftentimes still sore heart, still aching from my own family losses. "So happy you're part of our family now," Mrs. Harper would often say, squeezing my hand with a kindness that felt both uplifting and overwhelming. "Thanks, I really appreciate how welcoming you've been," I'd reply, feeling genuinely grateful. Visiting them became our weekend ritual. Those days were filled with backyard barbecues and lengthy chats over cups of steaming coffee. Life was good, simple, and honest, until it wasn't. Jake got called away on a long business trip, a whole year out of state. It was a fantastic opportunity for his career, but the timing was brutal. No sooner had Jake left than Mr. Harper's health took a nosedive. It happened fast, and Mrs. Harper, bless her heart, sounded near out of her mind with worry when she called. "Kimberly, I hate to ask, but I could really use your help around here. George is really not doing well." Her voice was thick with unshed tears. Without a second thought, I packed a bag and headed to the suburbs. Seeing Mr. Harper so frail shook me. He had always been a pillar, strong and steady. Now, he looked shrunken, tethered to his life through a maze of medical tubes. I slipped into the routine of their household seamlessly, handling the cooking and cleaning while Mrs. Harper focused on George's care. Evenings I spent sitting by Mr. Harper's side, reading out loud his favorite classics, his eyes often fluttering closed long before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Kimberly," he'd whisper on good days, his voice a shadow of his former robust tone. "It's my pleasure, really," I'd squeeze his hand, trying to offer comfort through simple touch. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Harper sat down at the kitchen table while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked worn, older than her years. "Kimberly, I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began, wringing her hands nervously. "George was the main earner, you know, and with him like this." I put down the knife, giving her my full attention. "We're strapped, honey. I hate to even ask, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this tough spot." She looked down, clearly embarrassed. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, Mrs. Harper. I'll get on it right away," I said firmly, trying to ease her burden. The apartment rented out quickly, and every month, I dutifully transferred the rental income to Mrs. Harper, along with money for groceries and whatever bills piled up. It wasn't easy. The commute to my job in the city became a nightmare. But family sticks together, right? That's what I kept telling myself, even on the hardest days. "Kimberly, you're a godsend," Mrs. Harper would often say, her relief palpable each time I handed her the money. "It's what family does," I'd respond, though some nights, as I lay in the guest room listening to the distant sounds of sirens from the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. Jake's calls were my only respite, his voice a tether to another life. "How's it going, Kim? You holding up okay?" His concern was always evident, even through the static of long-distance calls. "We're managing. Don't worry about us." I'd force cheerfulness into my voice, not wanting to add to his stress. Life in the Harper household took a drastic turn when Susan, Mrs. Harper's daughter from her first marriage, showed up unexpectedly. The vibe shifted immediately. She had that kind of presence, like a cold breeze that sneaks under the door. I never really knew Susan well, but I'd heard enough from Jake and even glimpsed her frosty relationship with Mr. Harper during brief, tense visits. My days had already stretched thin, juggling long commutes to work and caring for Mr. Harper, who was now bedridden and fading fast. Susan's arrival, however, added a whole new layer of tension. It was clear she was here to stay, making herself at home as if she owned the place. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Mr. Harper beckoned me to his side with a weak gesture. His voice was a hoarse whisper, strained and urgent. "Kimberly, you need to watch out for Susan. She's a very bad person." I leaned closer, the gravity in his tone pulling a knot tight in my stomach. "I understand, Mr. Harper. I'll be careful," I promised, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was promising against. True to Mr. Harper's warning, Susan wasted no time establishing her new regime. The first sign was when I found her in the kitchen one morning, her presence like a storm cloud over the breakfast nook. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to play housemaid or chef for anyone," she declared, her tone sharp as she sipped her coffee, eyeing me like I was an intruder in her mother's kitchen. I was taken aback, but managed to keep my cool. "Okay, Susan. I've been handling things so far, and I can keep at it," I said, trying to keep the peace. "Good, because I don't plan on lifting a finger. This is Mom's house, after all," she snapped back, her eyes daring me to challenge her. From that day on, Susan made sure her presence was felt and not in a good way. She'd order takeout just for herself and her mother, leaving their empty boxes on the table for me to clean up. Her disdain wasn't subtle, and it stung, but I swallowed the bitterness, because Mr. Harper needed peace. "Kimberly, why don't you sit and eat with us tonight?" Mrs. Harper asked one evening, a rare moment of old warmth in her voice. Before I could respond, Susan cut in sharply. "Mom, Kimberly's been busy all day, she probably prefers eating later." Her words were coated with fake concern, but the message was clear, I wasn't welcome. The days grew heavier, my chores doubling as Susan's entitlement filled every corner of the house. I'd hear her late at night, whispering with her mother, turning her against me with poison words. Mrs. Harper, once so kind and understanding, started to change too, her looks colder, her thank yous fewer. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Harper was gone. The funeral was a solemn affair, with Jake flying in just in time to say his goodbyes. It was the first time in months we were together, and the relief of having him by my side was palpable. Yet, amidst the mourning, I noticed the air had shifted significantly at the Harper residence. Susan was on her best behavior, treating everyone with a forced politeness. "How's everything been while I've been gone?" Jake asked me quietly during a brief moment we had alone after the service. "Fine, everything's been fine," I lied, forcing a smile. I didn't want to burden him further, his grief was enough to handle. "You sure? You look a bit worn out," he pressed, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's just been busy, you know, helping out around here," I reassured him, avoiding his gaze. It wasn't the time to delve into the mess that was brewing beneath the surface. As soon as Jake left, Susan dropped her act. The mask of the dutiful sister was gone, replaced by the sneering, dismissive attitude I'd grown accustomed to. The dynamic in the house shifted drastically. Mrs. Harper, perhaps in her own throbbing grief, became distant and cold towards me. Commands replaced conversations, and I felt more like an intruder than a family member. Susan took over the household like she was the lady of the manor. Her reign was marked by disregard for anyone's feelings, but her own. She started barging into my room without knocking, rummaging through my things as though she was searching for buried treasure. One afternoon, I was out in the garden trying to find some peace, when I stumbled upon a box lying among the shrubs. Curiosity piqued, I opened it, only to find my watches, jewelry, and even some underwear. My heart sank. Nearby, draped carelessly over a bush, were several of my dresses. Fury bubbled up inside me as I gathered my belongings. Clutching the box, I stormed inside, finding Susan in the living room, lounging like she owned the place. "What the hell, Susan?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. "You can't just throw my stuff out." Susan laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed mockingly around the room. "Live here? Please, you're just a guest, and not a welcome one. You should be out in the garden, or better yet, on the street. You're nothing but a rootless beggar anyway." Her words stung like salt in a wound. I couldn't believe the venom in her voice. Trembling, I turned to Mrs. Harper, who had just entered the room. "Mrs. Harper, please, tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too," I pleaded, my voice cracking. Mrs. Harper, once kind and gentle, now looked through me as if I were glass. "This is Susan's house now." "She's right, Kimberly. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live." Her words were a blow I hadn't anticipated. I stood there, the box in my hands, my heart breaking in my chest. The home I had come to know, the family I thought I had, crumbled around me in that instant. Despite everything, I stayed because of a promise I made to Mr. Harper on his deathbed, to look after his wife and not let Susan overpower her. But day by day, Mrs. Harper seemed to adopt Susan's cruel traits, her words turning sharp, her eyes cold. "You're just sitting on your hands here, aren't you?" Mrs. Harper snapped one evening as I cleaned up after dinner, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'm doing my best to keep things running smoothly," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the hurt her words caused. "Best? Could have fooled me. Seems like you're just freeloading," she scoffed, turning her back to me as she left the room. Her words stung. I was far from a freeloader. I had rented out my apartment and transferred nearly all that income to Mrs. Harper, on top of handling most of the housework, while Susan did nothing but criticize. Susan, living off her mother's pension, was relentless. "Really, what did my brother even see in you?" she would taunt me nightly, her voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls. I'd bite my tongue, swallow the anger and frustration, and remind myself of the promise I made. But the atmosphere was suffocating, the house a minefield of hostility. One evening, coming home early from work, my world tilted on its axis. I walked in to hear Susan and Mrs. Harper in the middle of a heated discussion in the living room, not noticing my arrival. "We need to get her to sell that apartment of hers. You know how much we could use that money," Susan was saying, her tone greedy and calculating. "Yes, but how do we convince her? Kimberly's no fool, she won't just hand it over." Mrs. Harper replied, her voice a mix of frustration and greed. Leave it to me, Mom. I'll sweet-talk her into it. Once she signs it over, we can finally live the way we deserve. Susan's words slithered through the air like a snake. Hearing them plot to strip me of my only financial security was a cold splash of reality. Fear gripped me. I couldn't stay, not anymore. My heart pounding, I slipped away to my room unnoticed. They were planning to rob me of everything. The decision was made right then, there was no staying after this. I hurriedly packed my essentials, my hands shaking. Every second in that house now felt like a countdown to disaster. I didn't bother with goodbyes, they didn't deserve them. Slipping out the back door, I ordered a taxi to the station. Sitting on the train to Jake's state, doubts swirled in my mind. Would Jake understand? Would he take their side? The uncertainty was crushing, but the fear of what might happen if I stayed was worse. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur by, a mix of fear and resolve settling in my chest. When I arrived at Jake's place, his reaction was a cocktail of shock, relief, and a swirl of questions. His eyes widened as he opened the door to find me standing there, bag in hand, looking probably as frazzled as I felt. Kimberly? What are you doing here? Is everything okay? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated, taking in the familiar, comforting sight of his temporary home. No, Jake, everything's not okay. Not at all, I replied, my voice catching a bit. He led me to the couch, his expression now lined with worry. Talk to me, babe. What happened? I told him everything, starting from Susan's return, the worsening conditions at home, the financial manipulations, and the final straw, the plot to make me sell my apartment. I hadn't wanted to worry him before, didn't want to add to his stress while he was away working. Jake's face darkened with each word I spoke. By the time I finished, his fists were clenched, his jaw set hard. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? He asked, his voice a mix of anger and concern. I didn't want to cause more trouble. I thought I could handle it, I admitted, feeling foolish now. Kimberly, damn it, you shouldn't have to handle anything like that alone, he exploded, standing up to pace the room. I can't believe my mom and Susan would treat you this way. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes intense. I'm not letting anyone treat my wife like that. No way, he declared, pulling out his phone. I watched, heart pounding, as he dialed his mother. The phone barely rang twice before she picked up. I couldn't hear her words, but the stiffness in Jake's shoulders told me enough. Mom, this has to stop. I know about everything, and I won't tolerate it. If Susan doesn't leave, and if you don't start treating Kimberly with respect, you can forget about us helping out anymore. No more money, no more nothing. Jake's voice was steel, not giving room for any argument. There was a brief, fiery exchange, then silence. Jake's hand tightened around the phone. Fine, if that's your choice, then you've made mine, he said finally, and hung up. He turned to look at me, his expression softening. Looks like it's just us now, babe. That's all we need, he said, coming over to wrap me in his arms. I leaned into him, the safety of his embrace fortifying me against the whirlwind of emotions. Just us, I murmured, feeling the truth of his words. We were on our own now, but somehow, that felt okay. Jake and I talked long into the night. We discussed practical things like my remote work arrangements and our financial plans without the extra drain of supporting his mother and Susan. It felt like we were laying the foundations for a new chapter, just the two of us. Whatever happens, we're in this together. You and me against the world, right? Jake said with a determined grin. Right, I smiled back, feeling more confident with him by my side. Against the world. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I contacted my job to arrange remote work, which thankfully, they agreed to. Jake helped me move my things from storage and set up a home office in the corner of his living room. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and it was peaceful. A week into our newfound peace, I was jolted by a call that almost felt like a ghost from a past life. It was Mrs. Harper. Her voice, once sweet to me, now dripped with a mix of desperation and audacity. "Kimberly, why haven't I received the money for this month? You know we depend on it," she demanded right off the bat. I was stunned silent for a moment, her nerve unbelievable. "I'm sorry, but after everything, you really expect me to continue supporting you?" I asked, my tone more incredulous than angry. In the background, I could hear Susan's voice, shrill and angry. "She's just an ungrateful girl, Mom. Make her transfer the money." Taking a deep breath to calm my rising anger, I remembered the venomous words they had thrown at me, words that stung deep. "Mrs. Harper, Susan called me a rootless beggar, remember? I'm not sending money to people who treat me like trash. I'm done." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost picture Mrs. Harper's shocked face. "But we're family," she finally said, her voice a mixture of anger and pleading. "No, family doesn't treat each other that way. Goodbye, Mrs. Harper," I said firmly and hung up before she could respond. The call shook me, but Jake was right there, his support unwavering. "You did the right thing, Kimberly. It's time they learn to stand on their own," he reassured me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. Not long after settling back into our hometown, another surprise came our way. I was pregnant. The news brought a joy we hadn't expected, and suddenly, the future seemed filled with possibilities. We decided it was time to sell my apartment and buy a small house in the suburbs, a place near a good school where our child could grow up. As we were planning our move, another call came, and again from Mrs. Harper. Her tone was different this time, desperate, almost pitiful. "Kimberly, I've made a mistake. Susan forced me to sell the house, took the money, and left me with nothing. Could I come and live with you and Jake?" Her voice was shaky, pleading. The request stunned me. After everything, this was a test of my resolve. "Mrs. Harper, you chose this path when you sided with Susan against us. You could have chosen differently," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I know I've made mistakes, but you have a kind heart. Can't you forgive an old woman for her wrong choices?" she implored. I sighed, feeling a pang of pity, but remembering the pain her choices had caused. "I forgave you long ago, but that doesn't mean I can let you back into my life. You need to live with the consequences of your actions, just as I have," I replied and ended the call. Then, with a resolute tap, I blocked her number. We moved forward with our plans, purchasing a quaint house with a little garden where our child could play. It was a lazy Sunday morning, the kind where you linger over coffee and the newspaper. I was flipping through the pages when a headline caught my eye: "Local woman arrested for massive fraud scheme." There, staring back at me from the paper, was Susan, handcuffed and looking defeated. I couldn't help the mix of shock and, admittedly, a slight vindication that washed over me. "Look at this, Jake," I called out, holding up the newspaper for him to see. "It's Susan. She's been arrested for fraud." Jake took the newspaper, scanning the article with a serious expression. "Well, can't say I'm surprised, but still, it's a lot to take in." "Yeah, it is. But she made her choices, and now she's facing the consequences," I replied, feeling a closure I hadn't realized I needed. The news eventually drifted to us through friends that Mrs. Harper was living in a tiny apartment, working 2 jobs to scrape by. Her pension wasn't enough to cover her living expenses and pay off the debts Susan had left her with. "Did you hear about your mom?" One of Jake's friends, Matt, brought it up one evening when they were over for a backyard barbecue. "Yeah, I heard," Jake responded, flipping burgers on the grill. His voice held a trace of sadness, but it was tempered with resolve. "She chose her path, Matt. It's tough, but that's how it is." Matt nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. "You're right, man. Just thought you should know." The conversation shifted after that, the evening air filled with the lighter topics of sports and work. Life had moved on, and so had we. The joy of our new life really crystallized when Mia came into the world. Becoming parents changed everything. It shifted our priorities, our dreams, and even healed some of the old wounds by filling them with new love. Can you believe she's ours? I whispered to Jake one night as we watched Mia sleeping peacefully in her crib. She's perfect, Kimberly. Just perfect, Jake murmured back, his voice thick with emotion. We spent our days marveling at each little milestone Mia achieved, each smile, each giggle. She was our little miracle, and with her, the hardships of the past seemed to recede, making room for new memories, better ones. Each day was simple, but filled with little moments of joy that stitched a tapestry of a happy family life.